A waitress warns a millionaire about his friend. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble house. Ethan Parker was no stranger to challenges. His rise in the tech industry had been built on hard work, shrewd decisions, and an unwavering loyalty to his friends, especially to James Carter, his business partner of many years. But as he sat in his office, the echo of Sophia's warning lingered, unsettling him in ways he wasn't prepared to admit. Why would a young waitress, someone who had no stake in his world, come forward with such a bold claim about James? And why had she seemed so certain? He replayed the encounter in his mind, recalling how Sophia had approached him with a hesitant but determined expression, her eyes darting nervously around the restaurant before fixing on him. "Mr. Parker," she had begun, her voice wavering slightly but firm, "I know this is probably none of my business, but you need to be careful about James Carter. I overheard something that made me feel like I had to warn you." Ethan had frowned, his gaze narrowing as he studied her. "And what exactly did you overhear?" he had asked, his tone a blend of skepticism and curiosity. Sophia had hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "It was about a plan," she had said quietly, almost as if speaking the words aloud made them more real. "He was discussing how to take control of Parker Innovations. I don't know all the details, but the way he talked, it sounded like he was going to betray you." Ethan had struggled to mask his irritation. The idea that James, his closest friend, his confidant, would plot against him seemed absurd. He had known James since their college days, had shared countless victories and setbacks with him. How could someone like Sophia, a stranger, know something he didn't? "Look," he had replied, keeping his voice level, "I appreciate your concern, but I think you must have misunderstood. James and I know what I heard." Sophia had interrupted, her tone more urgent now. "You don't have to believe me, but just be careful." Her eyes had held his for a moment longer. Then she had turned and walked away, leaving Ethan with a lingering sense of unease he couldn't quite shake. The following day, as he met with James, that sense of unease was sharper than ever. Ethan watched his friend closely, searching for any sign, however subtle, that might corroborate Sophia's warning. As James discussed the terms of the new deal they were about to sign, something seemed off. There was an unfamiliar tension in James's voice, a slight hesitation before he spoke, as though choosing his words with extra care. "Ethan, we need to move forward with this. The timing is crucial," James urged, his tone veering on the edge of insistence. Delaying the signing could jeopardize the entire investment. Ethan folded his arms, leaning back in his chair. "What's the rush, James? This investment will still be here tomorrow, next week, even next month. I'd like to review the documents more thoroughly before we commit." James's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible flicker that Ethan would have missed if he hadn't been scrutinizing every move, every reaction. "Since when do you hesitate?" James countered, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've always made decisions quickly. It's one of the reasons we've gotten this far." "Maybe," Ethan replied slowly, "but I'm not going to rush into anything without being absolutely sure." James held his gaze for a moment, the forced smile fading. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" There was a sharpness to his tone now, something defensive. "Of course not," Ethan lied smoothly, uncrossing his arms. "I just want to be thorough. It's my company too, after all." As James left the meeting, Ethan felt a bitter taste in his mouth. The man he had considered a brother seemed, for the first time, like someone he didn't know at all. The suspicion gnawed at him, a voice in the back of his mind whispering that Sophia might not have been mistaken after all. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his office, his gaze fixed on the city lights outside the window, but his mind far from the familiar skyline. He replayed the events of the past weeks, scrutinizing every conversation and every decision involving James. How many times had he missed signs that might have pointed to something deeper, something darker? He reached for his phone, a knot forming in his stomach as he made a decision. If James was indeed planning something, it wouldn't be discovered through casual observation. He needed professionals. People who knew how to follow the trails that led to secrets buried under layers of corporate jargon and legal technicalities. It didn't take long for the investigators to uncover the first red flag, a pattern of small, carefully disguised financial transactions directed toward offshore accounts. Each transfer seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a troubling mosaic. As he examined the detailed reports, a chill crept up Ethan's spine. How had he failed to see this? The man he trusted more than anyone had been siphoning money from the company in a way that suggested a long-term, calculated scheme. It wasn't just a betrayal that stung. It was a realization that he had allowed himself to be blind to the possibility. Ethan's trust in his own judgment had been shaken to its core. Staring at the papers scattered across his desk, he felt a deep ache settle in his chest. He had always believed in the power of loyalty, in the bonds formed through shared struggles and triumphs. But now, the very foundation of those beliefs was crumbling. What if James's friendship had always been a facade? What if Ethan had only seen what he wanted to see? As the night dragged on, he found himself replaying Sophia's words in his head. Just be careful. Her voice echoed in the silence of the room, mingling with his own unspoken questions. Asterisk, how much had I ignored? What else have I been blind to? Asterisk, the thought that there could be more hidden betrayals, more deceptions yet to be uncovered, was almost too much to bear. Ethan reached for his phone again, this time calling his legal team. The investigation would go deeper, much deeper. He was determined to unearth every secret, to expose every lie, no matter how painful. There would be no more second-guessing, no more blind trust. If he had to face the truth about his oldest friend, then he would do so with eyes wide open. And as the dawn approached, the unease that had first crept into his mind began to harden into something else, resolve. Ethan knew that he was about to confront not only the betrayal of a friend, but also the illusions he had built around himself. There would be a reckoning, and he would not rest until he knew the full extent of the truth. It was time to prepare for the confrontation that would change everything. Ethan chose the restaurant carefully. It was upscale enough to discourage any scene, yet private enough for a conversation that could shatter whatever remained of his trust. He arrived first, taking a seat in a corner booth, his back to the wall. As he waited, he rehearsed the confrontation in his mind, wrestling with the mix of emotions swirling inside him: anger, betrayal, disbelief. There was a time when James was more than a business partner. He was the person Ethan would call at midnight to discuss the future or lean on during the darkest days. Now, that bond seemed like a distant memory. James walked in a few minutes later, glancing around before spotting Ethan. He approached with his usual confident stride, but there was a hint of tension in his posture. He slid into the booth across from Ethan and forced a smile. I didn't expect you to suggest lunch. I thought you were still upset about postponing the deal. Ethan kept his gaze steady. I figured we should talk, he said, his tone flat. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, giving himself a moment before dropping the bombshell. Sophia heard you, you know. She overheard your conversation about taking over the company. James blinked, his smile faltering. What? Sophia, the waitress? He let out a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan, that's absurd. You're listening to some random girl now. Come on, man. Ethan's jaw tightened. She's not just some random girl, and I wouldn't dismiss her so quickly if I were you. She heard enough to make me rethink everything. His voice grew colder as he added, "Why don't you start by explaining what the hell is really going on?" James opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his expression shifting from incredulous to something darker. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Ethan, you have to understand, this wasn't about betraying you. It was about the company. You've been reckless with some of your decisions, and I had to step in. I've always looked out for you. For us." Ethan's eyes narrowed, feeling his pulse quicken with each word James uttered. "Reckless?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You call it reckless because I don't let fear dictate every move we make. I took risks, calculated risks, that got us where we are, and you used that as an excuse to undermine me." James's composure cracked slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "I wasn't undermining you. I was protecting the company from your impulsiveness. You might not see it that way, but that's what it was. Someone had to take responsibility for what exactly?" Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "For siphoning money into offshore accounts? For planning to push me out of my own company? Tell me, James, how does that protect anything other than your own interests?" James's face hardened, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps a hint of guilt. "I wasn't planning to push you out," he said through gritted teeth. "The offshore accounts were contingency plans. Do you know how many times we came close to losing everything? Those were backups. You don't understand the kind of pressure I was under, Ethan. You didn't see the full picture." Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, but also a deep sadness. The man sitting across from him was a stranger wearing the face of his oldest friend. "You had every chance to tell me," Ethan said quietly, "but instead, you chose to go behind my back. If you were really doing this for us, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you trust me?" There was a long silence. James's gaze fell to the table, his hands clenching into fists. "Because I knew you wouldn't listen," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You're always so damn sure of yourself, Ethan. Always pushing forward without looking back. I tried to talk to you about slowing down, about taking a more cautious approach, but you never wanted to hear it. You acted like we were invincible." Ethan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "So that's it? You betrayed me because I wouldn't listen to you? Because I didn't cower when you thought I should?" He leaned in closer, his voice cutting through the quiet of the restaurant. "Don't stand there and pretend this was about some noble cause. You weren't saving the company. You were saving yourself." James's eyes snapped back up, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "And what would you have done, Ethan? Let everything we built crumble just to prove a point? I had to make choices you didn't have the courage to make. Choices like betraying your best friend." Ethan's voice trembled with fury. "That's not courage, James. That's cowardice." The words hung in the air like a bitter verdict, and for a moment, both men were silent, the weight of years of friendship collapsing under the harsh light of reality. Ethan could see it now. James wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. The betrayal wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a calculated decision. The friend he thought he knew had made a choice to put his own ambition above their bond, and there was no coming back from that. Ethan stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "We're done," he said, his voice steady but cold. "I don't need your explanations, and I sure as hell don't need you." As he walked away, Ethan felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. It wasn't just a loss of a friend that cut so deep. It was a realization that he had been blind, that he had allowed his loyalty to cloud his judgment. He had built his life around trust, around the belief that certain bonds were unbreakable. But James had shattered that illusion, and now Ethan was left to pick up the pieces of his own naivety. That night, back in his office, Ethan sat in the dark, surrounded by the silence of the empty room. His mind replayed the confrontation, every word, every glance. The pain wasn't just from what James had done, but from the recognition that Ethan had failed to see the cracks forming long before they broke wide open. He had let his loyalty turn into a weakness, a vulnerability that James had exploited. As he sat there, Ethan began to question what friendship really meant, and whether he had ever truly known the man he called his best friend. Had James changed, or had Ethan simply failed to see who he truly was all along? It was time to reevaluate everything he thought he knew, not just about James, but about himself. And as he considered the next steps, one thing became clear. Ethan couldn't afford to let sentiment cloud his judgment any longer. The truth was harsh, and it had to be faced with eyes wide open, no matter how much it hurt. The man who had once believed in the unbreakable bonds of friendship was gone. In his place was someone who would learn to trust with caution, who would never again assume loyalty was a given. There would be no more blind faith, only a relentless pursuit of the truth. Ethan picked up the phone and called his lead investigator, his voice steady and firm. "I want to dig deeper," he said. "Find everything. Leave no stone unturned. There would be a reckoning." And Ethan was just getting started. Ethan couldn't shake the thought of Sophia. Her courage and the conviction in her voice had stuck with him, even as he confronted James and faced the harsh reality of betrayal. But something else lingered. Why had she risked so much to help him? Why had a young waitress gotten involved in the complex dealings of a tech mogul? There was more to Sophia than met the eye, and Ethan intended to find out. He arrived at her small house and hesitated for a moment before knocking. As the seconds ticked by, he found himself second-guessing the purpose of his visit. Was he here to thank her, or to unearth what lay beneath her warning? His thoughts were interrupted by the door opening to reveal Sophia, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. "Mr. Parker, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of nervousness and curiosity. Ethan noticed the subtle way she held onto the doorframe, as though bracing herself. He cleared his throat. "I came to thank you," he began, his tone sincere but tinged with a hint of suspicion. "And to ask why you took such a risk for someone you barely know." Sophia's expression shifted slightly, the nervousness giving way to a guarded look. She glanced past Ethan, as if checking to make sure they were alone, then stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. "I suppose you'd like some answers," she said, leading him into the modest living room. The space was sparse but cozy, with a few family photos on a shelf, none of which, Ethan noticed, included anyone resembling her. "Please sit." She motioned to the worn-out sofa as she took a seat across from him, a faint tremor in her hands as she clasped them together. "I didn't mean to overstep, Mr. Parker, but I felt like I had no choice. What I heard that night was disturbing." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady on her. "Disturbing enough to put yourself at risk? I find that hard to believe, Sophia. There has to be more to it." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "You're right," she said softly. "There is more. I didn't do this just for you. I did it for my brother." The words hung in the air, thick with emotion. Ethan's curiosity deepened, and he gestured for her to continue. "Months ago," Sophia began, her voice steadying as she spoke, "my brother, Alex, was drawn into a financial investment scheme. It promised high returns, seemed legitimate at first, but it was a fraud. The company bled him dry, and by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. He lost everything, his savings, his home. Even his health suffered from the stress. He tried to fight back, but the people behind it, they were untouchable. As Sophia spoke, Ethan noticed a hardness in her eyes, the kind that only comes from experiencing a deep injustice. He couldn't recover, she continued, and a few months later, he took his own life. The debt collectors hounded him until the end. Ethan's throat tightened as he listened. There was a rawness to her story, a pain that made it clear this was no mere act of compassion for a stranger. This was personal. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Sophia shook her head. The company he invested in was a front, and when I started digging into it, I found connections, people who had ties to larger firms, some of which even did business with Parker Innovations. Her gaze locked onto Ethan's, as if searching for the impact of her words. And one of those names kept appearing. James Carter. Ethan's breath caught. "James," he echoed, feeling a new chill settle over him. "You think he was involved in the scheme that targeted your brother?" "Maybe not directly," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I found records of meetings, financial transactions that passed through his circle. It's as if he was covering for someone or setting up a system that allowed this kind of thing to happen without raising any red flags. I couldn't prove it back then, and I didn't know how deep it went. But when I heard him talking about your company, it was like I was hearing echoes of what happened to Alex. The same kind of betrayal, the same hidden deals." Ethan listened intently, his mind racing to piece together this new information. Could it be that James's plans to take over Parker Innovations were just one part of a much larger scheme? He had thought James's betrayal was a personal matter, driven by greed or ambition, but now it seemed entangled in a web of corruption that reached beyond his company. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked, his voice tinged with both frustration and empathy. "Why wait until now to tell me?" Sophia's eyes darkened with a mix of regret and determination. "I was scared," she admitted. "I was a waitress, Mr. Parker. Who would have believed me? I had no power, no resources, and without proof, I'd be risking everything for nothing. But when I saw you that night at the restaurant and I heard James talking, I realized I couldn't just walk away again. Not when I knew someone else might be hurt, just like my brother was." Ethan felt a surge of respect for Sophia, but also a growing unease. If James was connected to the people who destroyed Alex's life, then this situation was far more dangerous than he had imagined. It wasn't just about saving his company. It was about exposing a network of exploitation and deceit that could go much deeper than he had thought. "Why didn't you try to reach out to me before?" he asked, his voice softer now, understanding the risk she had taken. "You could have—" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I had to be sure you would listen. That night was my chance, and I took it. I knew I was taking a gamble, but I didn't see another option. If you had dismissed me or thought I was crazy, well, then I would have known there was no hope for stopping this." Ethan leaned back, trying to absorb everything she had told him. It was clear now that Sophia wasn't just some bystander who had stumbled onto something big. She was someone who had suffered loss and was fighting back with everything she had left. Her story wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. It was a warning, a glimpse into a larger scheme that had claimed at least one life and nearly claimed his company as well. "Thank you for telling me," he said, rising from his seat. "I'm going to find out the truth, not just about James, but about all of this. I promise you that." As he turned to leave, Sophia stood up, a look of determination on her face. "Ethan," she called, making him pause at the doorway. "If you're going to go after them, be careful. These people, they don't play by the rules, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way. Ethan met her gaze, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. "I'm not going to back down," he replied. "Not this time." With that, he walked out of Sophia's house, his mind set on the task ahead. There were too many questions left unanswered, and too many connections that didn't add up. It was time to dig deeper, to expose not just James's betrayal, but the entire web of deceit. As he got into his car, he made a call to his lead investigator. "I need you to expand the scope of the investigation," he said. "There's more going on here than just corporate sabotage. I want every detail, every person connected to James's deals. Start with the companies that Alex Blake had ties with. We need to follow this to the end." The line went silent for a moment, and then the investigator responded, "Understood. I'll get started right away." Ethan hung up and gripped the steering wheel tightly. There was no turning back now. He was about to uncover the true scale of what had been hidden from him. And as he did, he would finally see James and the others for who they really were. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Ethan Parker wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. Armed with Sophia's information, Ethan plunged into an investigation that would take him deeper into the web of deceit surrounding James. What he uncovered was far more disturbing than he had anticipated. James's connections to the fraudulent investment scheme ran deeper than a few overlapping names. There were direct ties between him and several key figures involved in orchestrating the fraud that had left families ruined, including Sophia's. And the connections did not end there. As Ethan sifted through stacks of documents and transaction records, patterns began to emerge. Names linked to the investment scam had surfaced in dealings with Parker Innovations, sometimes as contractors, other times as part of mergers and acquisitions. These deals had passed through without raising alarms because they had been cloaked in legitimacy. But now, with a fresh perspective, Ethan could see the signs of manipulation. The fraudulent dealings were hidden within layers of contracts and transactions that appeared routine on the surface. Sitting at his desk late one night, Ethan's fingers tightened around a contract that bore James's signature. It was for a consultancy firm that, upon closer inspection, didn't exist beyond a virtual address and a shell website. Yet, the firm had received significant payments over the past 2 years. It became clear that Parker Innovations had been used as a vehicle to launder money. James had orchestrated a series of complex financial maneuvers to funnel illicit funds through his own company. The realization hit Ethan like a blow. This wasn't just a personal betrayal or a corporate power struggle. It was an exploitation of everything he had built. James had taken advantage of their company's success, its credibility, and its resources, all while presenting himself as a loyal partner. The next morning, Ethan met with Sophia in a small cafe, away from the office and any curious eyes. When he showed her what he had found, the color drained from her face as she scanned the documents. "This is bigger than I imagined," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "They were using your company to launder money." "Looks that way," Ethan said, his tone grim. "And it's not something that just started. Some of these transactions date back several years. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. James has been planning this for a long time." Sophia's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of anger and despair. How could he hide something like this from you for so long? Ethan's jaw tightened. Trust can blind you to a lot. I didn't think I needed to scrutinize every move he made because, well, he was James. He shook his head, the bitterness clear in his voice. I never imagined he could be capable of something like this. Sophia placed the papers down on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she did. "So what happens now? Do you take this to the authorities? The police?" I can't just hand this over without knowing the full extent of it, Ethan replied, his voice low. James isn't working alone. There are other players involved, and I need to identify them. If I go public with this now, they'll bury the evidence, cover their tracks. We need more than just these documents. We need to know exactly who's pulling the strings. Sophia nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. And what about Parker Innovations? If you keep digging, won't that put the company at risk? Maybe, Ethan admitted, but it's already at risk if I don't. If this blows up without me knowing all the details, it'll destroy everything. He let out a long breath. But if I can uncover the entire operation, I can minimize the damage and bring these people to justice. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of their realization. It was no longer just about exposing James. It was about dismantling a network of corruption that had used Parker Innovations as its pawn. And in that moment, Ethan understood that he was no longer just fighting for his company. He was fighting for the truth. "Tell me what I can do," Sophia said, her voice steady now. Ethan's gaze met hers, and he saw the same determination he had seen when she first approached him. "I need you to help me go through every piece of information we have. We need to connect every name, every transaction, and find out who else is involved. If you can track down any ties to that investment company that ruined your brother, it might give us a lead." Sophia nodded, already reaching for the stack of documents he had brought. "We'll find them," she said, a flicker of fire in her eyes. "We'll make sure they pay for what they've done." Over the next several weeks, Ethan and Sophia worked tirelessly, unraveling the complex network that James had woven. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that James had operated in the shadows for far longer than anyone realized. He had built alliances with individuals skilled in exploiting legal loopholes, leveraging off-the-books partnerships, and creating front companies that served as financial funnels. As Ethan dug deeper, he found himself reconnecting with memories he had long buried. There were deals and decisions he had signed off on, trusting James's judgment at the time. Now he saw how James had used Ethan's trust as a shield, conducting his illicit activities right under his nose. One night, while sifting through a set of encrypted emails recovered by the investigators, Ethan found a message that made his blood run cold. It was a correspondence between James and an anonymous partner, dated 5 years earlier, before Parker Innovations had even reached its current level of success. The content was vague, but the implication was clear. James had been laying the groundwork for his scheme long before any of the recent developments. The email read, "The groundwork is set. When the time comes, we'll be in full control. It's just a matter of waiting for the right moment." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words. It was undeniable proof that this betrayal had been years in the making, and James had never truly been the friend Ethan thought he was. This wasn't a recent shift in loyalty. It was a calculated, long-term deception. Ethan shared the email with Sophia the next day, her face tightening as she read the message. "He's been planning this since the beginning," she whispered. "He used you to build everything, only to take it all away when the moment was right." "That's what it looks like," Ethan replied, his voice cold. "And now, it's time to dismantle everything he's built." Ethan's next move was to confront another layer of the conspiracy. He tracked down an old acquaintance, someone he had once partnered with on a minor deal that James had arranged. The man, Raymond Hall, was now running a company that had questionable dealings with one of the shell firms Ethan had uncovered. If anyone could provide information on the people James was connected with, it would be Raymond. The meeting took place in a dimly lit office, with Raymond eyeing Ethan suspiciously as he took a seat across from him. "I didn't expect to hear from you, Ethan," he said, leaning back in his chair. Especially not about something like this. Ethan's expression remained impassive. I'm not here for pleasantries, Raymond. I need answers, and you're going to give them to me. Raymond's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. What do you know about these companies? Ethan asked, sliding a folder across the desk. And about James Carter's involvement. Raymond's face stiffened as he flipped through the documents. Look, Ethan, he began cautiously. James and we did some business together, but I had no idea it was connected to. Don't lie to me. Ethan cut him off, his tone dangerously calm. I know you were a part of this. If you don't start talking, I'll make sure you go down with the rest of them. Raymond hesitated, glancing at the folder again before finally sighing. All right, he conceded. There are things I know, things I've heard. But you have to understand, it's bigger than James. There are people involved who have a lot to lose, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens them. Ethan leaned in, his voice a low growl. That's exactly why you're going to help me take them down. You've been in the shadows for too long, Raymond. It's time to choose a side. As Raymond began to divulge names and details, Ethan felt a sense of resolve harden within him. He was finally starting to unravel the web that had ensnared him and his company. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous the game became. Ethan was ready for what lay ahead. He had been blind for too long, and now he would ensure that every hidden truth was brought into the light. The time had come to make his move. Ethan and Sophia worked late into the night, strategizing their next move. To expose James and his accomplices, they needed more than just evidence. They needed James to implicate himself. They devised a plan to trap him using his own ambitions and greed. The key was to make James believe that Ethan was on the verge of a breakdown and willing to compromise to save the company. Ethan would play the role of a desperate man reconsidering the partnership, inviting James into what would appear to be a reconciliation. But in reality, it would be a carefully orchestrated trap. Ethan arranged the meeting at an exclusive private club, a place James was known to frequent. The setting was familiar territory for him, a place where James would feel comfortable and in control. Ethan arrived first, taking his seat at a table tucked away in a secluded corner. He took a deep breath, preparing himself to play a role that went against his instincts. When James entered, he wore his usual air of confidence, but there was a faint curiosity in his eyes as he approached. Ethan, he greeted, flashing a quick smile as he took the seat across from him. I have to say, I wasn't expecting this. A meeting to reconcile? I thought you were ready to burn it all down. Ethan forced a tired smile. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, keeping his tone resigned. I've been under a lot of pressure. There are some irregularities in the company's finances that need addressing, and I'm starting to feel like I'm out of my depth. Maybe I was too quick to accuse you. James leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of concern mixed with careful curiosity. Irregularities? What are you talking about? Ethan sighed, allowing his gaze to drift to the table as though weighed down by the burden of his words. Certain deals, accounts, there are transactions I can't fully explain. They're being investigated now, and if things go south, it could all collapse. I'm thinking of closing some of the projects involved, just to cut the losses before the authorities start digging too deep. James's eyes narrowed slightly. Which projects exactly? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. The offshore deals, he said, carefully watching James's reaction. The consulting contracts, some of those companies don't even seem legitimate. If there's anything questionable, I'm shutting it down immediately. A flicker of tension crossed James's face, just for a moment, but it was enough for Ethan to notice. Then James forced a reassuring smile. Ethan, "Let me help you with this," he said smoothly. "If there are any issues, I can take care of them. You don't need to start closing deals and alarming investors. We can manage this quietly." There it was, confirmation. James's eagerness to handle the problem privately spoke volumes. It wasn't the offer of a concerned friend, but the response of a man with something to hide. Ethan masked his disgust, nodding as if he were considering the proposal. "Maybe," he replied, pretending to hesitate. "But I need to know I can trust you. If we're going to fix this together, I need full transparency. No more secrets." "Of course," James replied quickly. "You'll have my full support. I've always had the company's best interests at heart. You know that." Ethan let the silence linger, staring at James as if weighing his words. The longer he looked, the more he saw through the facade. James's confidence was a thin veneer covering the fear of exposure. "We need to start by cleaning up those offshore accounts," Ethan said finally. "If the investigators dig any deeper, it could bring us both down. I'm not willing to take that risk." James's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, a shadow crossed his eyes. "Leave that to me," he said, his voice slightly strained. "I'll make sure those accounts are handled." Ethan forced himself to nod, allowing James to believe he had just gained the upper hand. "Fine," he said, "but if I find out there's more you're not telling me, this whole deal is off." James's smile returned, more genuine this time. "You won't regret this, Ethan. We'll get through this. Just like always." After the meeting, Ethan and Sophia reconvened in a small office Ethan had rented for their investigation, keeping it off the radar of Parker Innovations. Ethan recounted every detail of the conversation, each reaction and hesitation from James. "He took the bait," Ethan said, a hint of triumph in his voice. "He's nervous about the offshore accounts and wants to handle them himself. He's trying to cover something up." Sophia's eyes lit up. "If he's going to move the funds, we'll need to monitor the accounts closely. Any sudden changes could be our smoking gun. I've already set up a system to flag any large transfers or unusual activity," Ethan replied. "But we need more than just financial records. We need evidence that links these accounts to the shell companies and the fraudulent deals. If we can tie it all back to James, we'll have what we need to take him down." Sophia leaned over the documents spread across the desk. "We should also keep an eye on his meetings," she suggested. "If he's panicking, he'll reach out to his partners to shore up their stories or make contingency plans. We might find a weak link." Ethan nodded in agreement. "Raymond Hall," he said, mentioning the associate who had recently given him some information. "He's involved, but there's more he hasn't told us. I'll pay him another visit and make sure he understands what's at stake." A few days later, Ethan arranged a discreet meeting with Raymond at an unassuming bar on the outskirts of the city. The man arrived looking more anxious than before, his eyes darting around the dimly lit space as he took a seat across from Ethan. "You again," Raymond muttered, his tone a mix of irritation and resignation. "I already told you everything I know." "No," Ethan replied, leaning in closer. "You told me what you thought I wanted to hear. But I think you know more, and I think you're scared to admit just how deep you're in." Raymond's gaze faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan didn't break eye contact. "The offshore accounts, the shell companies. You're connected to more than one of them. And I'm betting James didn't keep you in the dark about his plans. I'm giving you a chance to come clean now, before I turn over what I've found to the authorities." Raymond's face paled, and he swallowed hard. "Look, James was the one who orchestrated everything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He had people in place to keep everything compartmentalized. I was just doing what I was told. Who else is involved?" Ethan demanded, his voice cold. I want names. Raymond hesitated, glancing around as though the walls themselves were listening. There's someone, a financier named Caldwell. He's a major player, but he stays out of sight. If James is going to move the funds, it'll be through Caldwell. Ethan's jaw tightened. How do I find him? You don't, Raymond replied, shaking his head. Caldwell doesn't do business directly. He uses intermediaries, but if you dig into his network, you might find a lead. Ethan stood up, his expression a mask of resolve. If you're lying to me, Raymond, you'll be the first one I bring down. Remember that. Armed with Raymond's information, Ethan returned to the office to share the latest development with Sophia. Caldwell, he said, dropping the name like a bombshell. He's the one James uses to move the money. We need to find a way to track his intermediaries and get closer to the source. Sophia's eyes gleamed with determination. If we can expose Caldwell's role, we'll have the final piece to connect everything. It's time to play James's game and beat him at it. Ethan nodded, feeling the momentum shift in their favor. They were getting closer to the truth, and with every move, James was digging his own grave deeper. Now, it was just a matter of time. With the evidence gathered, Ethan knew it was time to take the final step. He had amassed enough documents, recorded conversations, and financial data to build a case against James and his co-conspirators. It was no longer just about protecting Parker Innovations. It was about justice. When he contacted the authorities, he did so with a steady voice, recounting the crimes James had committed with cold precision. It wasn't long before the police and federal agents swept in, armed with warrants. Ethan stood at a distance as the agents arrived at James's penthouse. Watching through the tinted windows of his car, he saw James being let out in handcuffs, his expression a mix of defiance and shock. It was a jarring sight. Seeing the man who had once been his closest friend, now reduced to a criminal facing the consequences of his actions. James spotted Ethan's car as he was being escorted to the police vehicle. His eyes locked with Ethan's, and for a brief moment, there was a look of disbelief, almost as if he couldn't comprehend how everything had crumbled around him. Ethan felt no satisfaction in that moment, only a hollow ache. The victory was there, but it was tainted by the cost of what had been lost. After the arrest, Ethan met with Sophia in the same modest office they had used throughout the investigation. The news of James's indictment was already making headlines, and the scandal had rocked Parker Innovations to its core. The company's stock had taken a hit, and employees were scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. Sophia was already there when Ethan arrived, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she said quietly, as he took a seat across from her. "He's finally going to pay for what he did." Ethan nodded slowly, but his gaze was distant. "The company will recover," he said, almost as if trying to convince himself. "We can rebuild. But it's not the ending I wanted." Sophia's eyes softened as she watched him. "You did what had to be done, Ethan," she said gently. "You saved the company from being destroyed. You stopped James from hurting anyone else." Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I couldn't see it, Sophia. All those years, I was blind to who he really was. And now I'm not sure if I can trust my own judgment." There was a raw vulnerability in his voice, one that Sophia hadn't heard before. She leaned forward, her tone reassuring. "You were betrayed by someone you considered family," she said. "There's no way you could have seen that coming. But that doesn't make you weak, Ethan. It just makes you human." He met her gaze, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "But rebuilding the company is only part of the challenge. I have to face the fact that I let this happen, that I let James get close enough to do this, Sophia reached out, placing a hand on his. You didn't let this happen. James chose his path. He betrayed you because of his greed, not because of anything you did. You can't blame yourself for his choices. Ethan nodded, but the guilt still lingered, clinging to the edges of his thoughts. The collapse of his friendship with James left a void that couldn't be easily filled. He had lost more than just a business partner. He had lost a part of his own identity. The man who had believed in loyalty and unbreakable bonds now had to learn to navigate a world where trust was fragile and betrayal was always a possibility. In the days that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly to stabilize Parker Innovations. He met with the board, addressed the employees, and reassured the company's investors that the recent turmoil would be managed and resolved. The damage control was exhausting, and the media's scrutiny was relentless. But slowly, signs of recovery began to emerge. Amidst the chaos, he and Sophia formed an unexpected bond. Their shared experience in uncovering the truth had forged a connection that went beyond mere friendship. It was a sense of mutual understanding, a recognition of the scars they both carried from their pasts. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Ethan found himself at the office again, staring at a photo on his desk. A picture of him and James from years ago, taken during the early days of Parker Innovations. He hadn't had the heart to remove it yet, but now, as he looked at it, he felt the weight of disillusionment settle deeper in his chest. Sophia walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. I figured you'd still be here, she said, setting one of the cups on his desk. Ethan glanced up and managed a tired smile. I didn't realize I was that predictable. You're just dedicated, she replied, her tone warm but firm. Which is why the company is going to get through this. He looked back at the photo, then slowly turned it face down. It's not just a company, he said, almost to himself. It's everything else that comes with it. The memories, the trust. I built this place with James. I believed in him. Sophia took a seat across from him, studying his face for a moment. And now you're building it without him, she said. You're stronger than you think, Ethan. You proved that by taking him down. Even though it cost you, Ethan was silent for a moment before he spoke. You know, when I first confronted him, part of me hoped he'd have an explanation. Something that would make it all make sense. Something I could forgive. He shook his head, his voice softening. But there was nothing, just lies. Sophia leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. Sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to accept, but you faced it. That's more than most people would have done. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt a small, flickering sense of closure. Thank you, Sophia, he said, for everything. You've done more than just help me expose James. You've helped me face my own doubts. She smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. You've helped me too, Ethan. I never thought I'd see justice for my brother. But now, it feels like there's finally some peace. They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding between them growing stronger. The chaos of the past months had taken its toll, but in each other, they found a strange kind of solace, a sense that they could move forward together. As Sophia left the office that night, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope, not just for the company, but for himself. It was time to rebuild, not only the business, but his own beliefs about trust and loyalty. He would not let this betrayal define him. There was still much work to be done. But for the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, he could emerge from this stronger than before. Ethan's decision to invite Sophia to join Parker Innovations wasn't made lightly. She had proven herself time and again during the investigation, and he knew she had a rare combination of insight and resilience. He offered her a key role in internal auditing, a position that would place her at the heart of the company's efforts to implement stricter oversight and prevent any future corruption. It was a significant step, not just for Parker Innovations, but for Sophia as well. He approached her with the offer one evening as they sat in the office, going through the latest updates on the company's restructuring. "Sophia," Ethan began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking about what comes next for the company and for us. The work we did to expose James showed me that I need someone I can trust, someone who understands how these things can be hidden in plain sight." He paused, looking directly at her. "I want you to come on board officially. Help me ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Sophia blinked, clearly taken aback. "You're offering me a job?" she asked, the surprise evident in her voice. "Not just any job," he clarified. "Head of Internal Audit and Compliance. It's a critical role. You'd be responsible for ensuring our new policies are followed to the letter, rooting out any issues before they can grow into problems. I need someone who can see the details that others miss. Someone who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions." Sophia hesitated, her expression shifting as she absorbed the weight of his words. "Ethan, I don't know if... I've never worked in a corporate setting at this level before. What if I'm not?" "You are," Ethan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You proved that already. What you did during the investigation wasn't just luck. You have a way of getting to the truth that's invaluable. And besides," he added with a faint smile, "I could use an ally I can actually trust." Sophia's eyes softened, and she exhaled slowly, nodding. "If you're sure, then I'm in," she said. "I think it's time I found a new purpose anyway. This feels right." Ethan's smile widened. "Good, because we have a lot of work to do." With Sophia on board, Parker Innovations embarked on a transformation. The restructuring process wasn't just about damage control. It was about building a foundation stronger than the one James had corrupted. Ethan and Sophia worked closely together, often staying late into the night as they designed new policies aimed at enforcing transparency and accountability across all departments. They revamped the company's internal audit protocols, introducing a rigorous system for financial checks and balances that made it nearly impossible for anyone to conceal illicit activities. For Sophia, the work was cathartic. She dove into the intricacies of each policy with determination, driven by the desire to ensure that what happened to her brother, and nearly happened to Parker Innovations, would not happen again. One afternoon, Ethan and Sophia were in the boardroom, reviewing the latest updates on the compliance initiatives. They had spent the morning meeting with department heads, getting feedback on how the changes were being implemented. Ethan could see that Sophia was thriving in the role. She had a keen eye for details and a natural authority that commanded respect, even from the more seasoned executives. "Your recommendations on the whistleblower policies were a game changer," Ethan remarked, setting down the report he had been reading. The board was impressed. Sophia's smile was modest, but there was a glint of pride in her eyes. "It's not just about making the policies look good on paper," she replied. "We need to make sure people know they'll be protected if they come forward. That's the only way to create a culture where transparency is actually valued." Ethan nodded, admiring her conviction. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I never would have imagined someone with no formal corporate background could step in and have this kind of impact. But you've made the transition look easy." Sophia chuckled softly. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "There were times I felt like I was in way over my head. But I realized I couldn't let my fears stop me. If I did, then James and people like him would have won." Ethan's gaze grew more intense as he listened to her. "It's not just about the company for you, is it?" he asked quietly. "This is about your brother." Sophia's expression faltered. and she nodded slowly. Part of it is, she confessed. But it's also about finding a way to turn all that pain into something constructive. I don't want to be defined by what happened to him or by the anger I felt for so long. Working here, making these changes, it's like taking that anger and reshaping it into something useful. Ethan reached across the table and placed a hand over hers, his voice sincere. You're doing more than just making changes, he said. You're giving this place a new direction, one I wish we had set out on a long time ago. Sophia looked at him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. And you're giving me a chance to do something I never thought I'd be able to do, she said. To finally feel like I'm making a real difference. Months passed, and the results of the restructuring became apparent. Parker Innovations began to regain the trust of its investors and clients. The changes Ethan and Sophia had implemented were not just cosmetic. They were transformative, establishing a new standard for how the company conducted its business. Sophia's efforts in the auditing department led to the identification and elimination of several smaller issues that could have escalated into larger problems down the line. It was clear that the culture within the company was shifting toward one of accountability. Ethan watched this progress with a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time since the scandal broke, he could see a path forward that didn't involve merely surviving. It involved thriving. His relationship with Sophia had deepened as well, not in a romantic sense, but in a way that suggested they had found a kind of kinship through their shared struggles. They had both emerged from their respective trials scarred, but stronger. One evening, after the day's meetings had wrapped up, Ethan found Sophia in the office, poring over a set of documents. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work with the same intensity she had shown since joining the company. You know, he said, breaking the silence, I don't think we'd be where we are right now if you hadn't come on board. You've helped this place heal and helped me heal, too. Sophia looked up, surprised by his candidness. I think we've helped each other, Ethan, she replied. It wasn't just me. You had to face everything, even the parts of the truth that hurt the most. That takes real courage. Ethan crossed the room and took a seat across from her. What do you see happening next? He asked. For the company and for you? Sophia's gaze drifted thoughtfully over the documents on the desk. I see a future where Parker Innovations isn't just known for its technology, but for its integrity, she said. And as for me, I think I'm finally ready to stop looking back. It's time to start building something that isn't just about fixing the past. Ethan smiled, nodding in agreement. Then let's make it happen, he said. Together, as they stood to leave, a sense of closure seemed to settle over them both. They had weathered the storm and come out stronger, scarred but not defeated. And now, with a renewed sense of purpose, they were ready to build a future on the lessons learned from the past. It was time to turn the page. Justice had been served, or so Ethan thought. James and several of his accomplices were facing criminal charges. Parker Innovations was rebuilding its reputation, and Ethan felt some semblance of closure. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling that not everything had been uncovered. As the dust settled, questions remained, loose threads that didn't quite add up. Throughout the investigation, names had appeared and disappeared. Connections had surfaced that led nowhere, and whispers of shadowy figures remained just that, whispers. Ethan had been around long enough to understand that the world of high-stakes business was often a tangled web of ambition, greed, and deception. Yet, the extent of betrayal that had unfolded made him realize he had underestimated just how deep that darkness ran. For every answer he had found, a dozen more questions seemed to emerge. Sophia had become more than just a colleague. She was now his most trusted confidant. She shared his concerns and knew that despite the progress they had made, The story wasn't over. They had exposed James's criminal network, but the unearthed documents hinted at something bigger, suggesting that James had been acting on behalf of others and perhaps was only a small part of a much larger scheme. On the final day before Ethan was set to take a break after months of relentless work, Sophia walked into his office, her face pale as she clutched a manila envelope. She set it on his desk without a word. Her silence said more than any explanation could. "What is this?" Ethan asked, eyeing the envelope. He could already sense the gravity of what lay inside. Sophia's voice was steady but tense. "It was left on my desk this morning. No return address, no note, just this." She gestured to the envelope. "I think you need to see what's inside." Ethan opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a stack of documents. As he flipped through them, his eyes narrowed. The papers detailed various financial transactions, offshore accounts, and emails. Communications involving high-profile names he hadn't seen during the initial investigation. Some of the documents included references to Parker Innovations, but in ways that suggested even deeper layers of manipulation. His heart sank as he realized what he was looking at. These connections, they point to companies we've never even considered, he murmured, scanning the pages with growing urgency. James was involved, yes, but it looks like he was just one piece of this. Sophia nodded, her expression grim. "And if that's true, then there's a network out there we haven't touched. Whoever sent this wanted us to know that we've only scratched the surface." Ethan set the papers down, his jaw tightening. This means there are more people involved, powerful people who stayed out of the spotlight. The entire operation James was part of, it was a distraction. Sophia's eyes held a mixture of concern and resolve. "Ethan, whoever sent this to us has more information. They're trying to pull us deeper into this, but we don't know if we can trust them." He leaned back in his chair, contemplating their next move. "We can't ignore it," he said finally. "The risk is too great. If there's more corruption tied to Parker Innovations, or if the company was being used as a front for something bigger, we need to find out who's behind it." The following morning, Ethan's phone rang just after sunrise. It was Sophia, her voice edged with urgency. "Ethan, I've been going through those documents all night. There's something we missed, hidden layers in the transactions. I traced one of the offshore accounts and found a link to a major hedge fund. It's one of the largest in the country, and it has ties to several government contracts." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Government contracts," he repeated. "Are you saying this goes beyond corporate crime?" "Yes," Sophia replied, "and it gets worse. There are indications that some of these funds were funneled into political campaigns and international ventures. If that's true, then we're talking about a network that extends far beyond just corporate interests. It's political." Ethan gripped the phone tighter, a mixture of dread and determination coursing through him. "We need to meet," he said. "This is bigger than anything we've dealt with so far. If we're going to expose this, we'll need more than just the two of us." Sophia hesitated before responding. "Ethan, if we go down this road, we'll be going up against people with serious power. It's not just about the company anymore. It's about an entire system." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "But if we don't, then everything we've done so far will mean nothing. James might have been a pawn, but someone was playing him. We need to find out who that is." They spent the next few weeks assembling a team of trusted experts, investigators, legal advisors, and even a few former intelligence operatives who had the skills to dig into the kinds of secrets that didn't show up in public records. As they delved deeper into the documents from the anonymous envelope, they began to uncover connections that spanned continents. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, real estate ventures in Eastern Europe, and suspicious transfers linked to high-profile figures in both finance and politics. Ethan and Sophia worked tirelessly, piecing together a puzzle that seemed to grow larger with each discovery. The documents pointed to a sophisticated operation that had been active for years, hiding behind legitimate businesses while laundering money, influencing policy, and orchestrating corporate takeovers. One evening, as they reviewed their findings in the dimly lit office, Ethan spoke up. "It feels like we're dealing with something on a scale we've never faced before. These aren't just corporate criminals. They're power brokers. They manipulate markets, control companies, even influence governments." Sophia nodded, her expression intense. "If we expose them, it won't just be a scandal. It could bring down entire industries. But if we don't," she trailed off, the implications too dire to put into words. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes filled with a fierce resolve. "We've come too far to back down now," he said. "We're going to keep pushing, no matter how dangerous it gets. This time, we're not just fighting for the company. We're fighting for the truth." As they prepared to take their findings to a trusted journalist, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come since that fateful warning from Sophia at the restaurant. What had started as an effort to save Parker Innovations had evolved into a mission to uncover a global conspiracy. There were still many unknowns, but one thing was clear. They were no longer simply reacting to threats. They were confronting them head-on. The days ahead would be perilous, with powerful adversaries lurking in the shadows, ready to protect their secrets at any cost. But Ethan and Sophia had already proven they were willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. As they walked out of the office together, a sense of quiet determination settled over them. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.